Imagine a room, not a digital room, not a server farm, a physical room with timber floors and oil lamp light, where the smell of sizing on new cloth bindings hangs in the air like something sacred. Thousands of volumes, arranged by a logic older than the Republic. You reach for a subject, not a number, not a code, a subject, in the language of the discipline itself. Natural philosophy here. Theology there. History arranged by empire, by century, by language of origin. The room knows things the way a cathedral knows things, not by index, but by position. You learn it the way you learn a city, by walking it, by being wrong, by finding the thing you weren't looking for directly next to the thing you were. This is 1875, and it is about to end. Somewhere in Amherst, Massachusetts, a 23-year-old library assistant named Melville Dewey is finishing a manuscript, 44 pages. He believes it is the most democratic document in the history of human knowledge. He is not entirely wrong, but what he has built, without quite understanding what he has built, is a machine. And like all machines designed to concentrate enormous energy into frictionless, repeatable output, it will become, in time, impossible to stop. Something about this doesn't add up. A system designed to open knowledge to everyone ended up locking it into a single tradition's shape, permanently, across 135 countries, with no mechanism anyone could afford to use to correct it. To understand how this ended, you have to go back to the ancient world, to the moment the foundational vulnerability was first installed, and to the one design decision made 24 centuries before Dewey was born that made his machine unstoppable. Somewhere around 245 BCE, a Greek scholar named Callimachus of Cyrene walked into the Library of Alexandria with a problem no one had ever faced at such scale. 500,000 scrolls, maybe more. No numbering system, no call code, no universal notation. The library's organization was, in the most literal sense, institutional memory. The accumulated knowledge of custodians who had worked there long enough to know where Euclid lived, and where Aristotle's biological works had been shelved after the last reorganization, and which Homeric variants were stored in which alcove by which regional dialect. Callimachus built the Pinakes, the first known library classification system in the Western record. It organized by author, by genre, by biographical note. It was not a numbering system. It was a catalog of judgment. Who wrote what? In what tradition? In relation to what other works? It was, in essence, a scholar's argument about how knowledge related to itself. The Pinakes worked. It worked for centuries, in the sense that trained custodians could navigate it, but it had a structural requirement no one had yet named. It required a human being who understood the argument. Strip out that human being, and the system was a list of names pointing to positions no longer reliably known. This was the foundational vulnerability of every library system for the next 2,000 years. The knowledge was in the arrangement. The arrangement lived in people. By 1602, when Thomas Bodley opened his great library at Oxford, the problem had only grown. The Bodleians' first printed catalogue, issued in 1605, organized by faculty theology, medicine, law, arts in a hierarchy borrowed directly from medieval European university structure. It was a human institution masquerading as a neutral system, and it was already showing stress fractures. The books arrived faster than the argument about how to organize them could keep pace. The system worked as long as someone remembered where everything was. That's where the official explanation of what happened next begins to fall apart. Between 1800 and 1870, something happened to the printed word that had never happened before in the history of human civilization. It industrialized. American book production stood at roughly 2,500 titles per year in 1820. By 1870, that figure had surpassed 12,000 titles annually and was still accelerating. Steam-powered presses, cheaper paper, rising literacy rates, the railroad distributing print to towns that had never sustained a bookshop. Fewer than 200 public libraries existed in the United States before 1850. By 1876, that number had crossed 3,000. The catalog, the handwritten, intercalated, lovingly maintained ledger, was collapsing under the weight of its own contents. Each new acquisition required a human decision. Where does this live? In which tradition? Under which subject heading? Entered by hand into a ledger that could not be reorganized without being rewritten. Checked by a librarian who had to hold the entire intellectual map in their head, or work from a handwritten cross-reference system so tangled it had become effectively unusable to anyone but its creator? Charles Coffin Jewett had seen this coming. As librarian of the Smithsonian Institution from 1848 to 1854, Jewett proposed a centralized, standardized catalog system, printed cards distributed to libraries nationally that could function as a kind of distributed brain, carrying institutional memory across institutions. Congress did not fund it. The Smithsonian's leadership shelved the proposal. No explanation was entered into the official record. The problem was left to grow. The books arrived faster than any human system could absorb them. Something had to give. And here is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, because the person who gave it, the person who stepped into the exact vacuum that Jewett's failed proposal had left open, was not a senior librarian, not an experienced cataloger, not a committee of scholars appointed by a learned society. He was a 21-year-old college student working part-time. In 1873, Melville Dewey took a job at the Amherst College Library and found the catalog by his own description in a state of productive chaos. There was a system, multiple systems in fact, competing with one another across different parts of the collection, artifacts of different librarians, different arguments about how knowledge should be organized. Dewey, who was a man of almost frightening organizational energy, found this intolerable. Over the next 3 years, in the margins of his academic work, he designed a solution. His system was, in its conception, a work of genuine intellectual elegance. 10 main classes, 000 through 900, each subdivided, decimally, theoretically to infinite depth. A pure notation system, no subject expertise required, no institutional memory necessary. Any book could be located by any trained person in any library in any city, using identical notation and identical logic. He published it in 1876, 44 pages. First edition, he was 24 years old. The system's central promise was democratization. A small-town library in Ohio could organize itself identically to the Astor Library in New York. A new hire with no prior library experience could shelve and retrieve materials on their first day. The catalog would no longer live in people. It would live in numbers, which could be printed, standardized, and distributed. It looked like liberation. But this is where the investigator has to slow down, because the deeper you look into what Dewey actually built, the more the official story of a neutral, rational, universalizing system begins to show its seams. Dewey did not build a neutral system. He built the most systematic expression of one intellectual tradition that had ever been attempted, a Protestant, Anglo-American, 19th century university-educated hierarchy of knowledge, encoded in decimal notation, so precise, so frictionless, so mechanically efficient that it would become, within 40 years, the load-bearing infrastructure of the world's public knowledge architecture. That is twist one. The irony, the history of this technology requires you to hold clearly. He built the most controlled, rational system in the intellectual world, and its very rationality made it impossible, once installed, to correct without destroying the machine entirely. It looked like liberation. It was also a lock. 7 years after publication, Dewey got his proving ground. In 1883, he was appointed librarian at Columbia College in New York. It was the first opportunity to retrofit the Dewey Decimal Classification onto an existing major institutional collection, thousands of volumes, previously organized under a subject-based system, now to be relabeled, reshelved, and recatalogued under decimal notation. The operation was a logistical campaign. Every volume pulled from its shelf, every classification decision made, recorded, applied. Old subject arrangements dismantled, not gradually, not in parallel, but completely, because the two systems could not coexist. The card catalog replaced handwritten ledgers. Dewey also, at Columbia, opened the first formal library science school in the United States. He admitted women to the program at a time when Columbia as a whole did not a genuine act of institutional courage, and one that would permanently associate the DDC with a new class of trained, professional female librarians who would carry it into public library systems across the country. The Columbia installation worked. The American Library Association, which Dewey had co-founded in the same year he published the DDC, took notice. Other institutions began to adopt. Not universally, not yet, but the logic of adoption was beginning to compound, and once it compounded, it would not reverse. One installation, then another, then there was no going back. In 1881, a Scottish-American steel industrialist named Andrew Carnegie made his first library donation. By 1929, when the Carnegie Corporation finally ended its library grant program, it had funded the construction of 2,509 public libraries across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and beyond. Carnegie's grants came with conditions, not always explicit, not always written into the grant documents in legal language, but effectively mandatory. The community had to provide land, ongoing operating funds, and a functional catalog. And a functional catalog, by 1890, meant the Dewey Decimal Classification, because the DDC was what the American Library Association endorsed, and the ALA was what the professional class of trained librarians trusted. And trained librarians were what you needed to run a Carnegie library. The effect was structural and irreversible. Carnegie's capital flowing into thousands of buildings in thousands of communities required DDC adoption as a condition of financial viability. Libraries that used alternative systems found themselves unable to share catalog records with neighboring institutions. Librarians trained in the DDC found themselves unemployable in institutions that didn't use it. The ALA formalized this pressure into standardization resolutions through the first decade of the 20th century. By 1910, the Dewey Decimal Classification was not merely a cataloging tool. It was infrastructure. It was the floor under every public library in the English-speaking world. The books were shelved inside it. The training was built around it. The architecture of Carnegie's standardized buildings was oriented to it. The machine didn't conquer the library world. The library world built itself around the machine. And this is where the pattern becomes deeply uncomfortable. Because at the exact moment the machine achieved total dominance, the first evidence of what it could not see was being published. In 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk. It entered library collections across the United States. And the Dewey Decimal Classification, the neutral, rational, democratizing system, had to find it a home. In the DDC's first edition, Christianity occupied the entirety of the 200 seconds. An entire division of the classification scheme, with scores of subdivisions for denominations, doctrines, ecclesiastical history, and liturgical practice. All other world religions, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Shinto, the spiritual traditions of every non-Christian civilization on earth were compressed into the 290s. A single subdivision, a footnote, in decimal form, to the presumed centrality of Protestant Christianity. African American history was a subcategory of American history. Non-Western philosophy was compressed into the margins of the 100 seconds. Indigenous knowledge systems, oral, ecological, relational, organized by principles that had no referent in the DDC's grid, simply did not appear. These were not accidental omissions. They were the direct expression, in notation, of the intellectual hierarchy that Dewey had absorbed from his own education, his own era, his own tradition. He had not designed a neutral system. He had designed an extremely precise encoding of what a 24-year-old Anglo-American Protestant academic in 1876 believed knowledge was. And the machine had no mechanism for self-correction. Every number assigned to every book in every library was a load-bearing element. Change the number, and you change the location of every book carrying that number in every library that had adopted the system. The decimal machine could be patched at the margins. Its foundational hierarchy could not be rebuilt without pulling down the entire structure. The system worked perfectly. It simply could not see everything. Melville Dewey died on the 26th of December, 1931, in Lake Placid, Florida. He had spent the last decades of his life at a resort he owned in the Adirondacks. Organized, with characteristic intensity, according to his own principles of efficiency. He had simplified the spelling of his own name from Melville to Melville as part of a broader spelling reform movement he believed would rationalize the English language. He had been expelled from the American Library Association, ultimately not for anything wrong with his classification system, but for his personal conduct, a serial harasser of women who were also, in the professional world he had built, his primary institutional constituency. He left behind a classification system maintained by Forest Press, a publishing operation that would control DDC editorial decisions for the next 60 years. In 1942, the 14th edition of the DDC was published. In 1951, the 15th edition followed and was immediately repudiated by the library community it was designed to serve. The 15th edition had reorganized the classification so extensively that libraries adopting it would face recataloging large portions of their existing collections. The ALA's response was effectively a revolt. Forest Press was forced to issue a standard edition that walked back most of the changes. No announcement framed this as a failure. The incident revealed the machine's deepest structural problem. Each edition had to evolve to accommodate new knowledge, new fields, new disciplines that Dewey had never imagined. But each evolution was so costly in labor, in recataloging, in disruption to existing collections that libraries resisted change even when change was necessary. The system calcified not because it was adequate, but because changing it was more expensive than tolerating its inadequacy. They could not change the machine without breaking it, so they left it running. By the mid-20th century, the Dewey Decimal Classification had spread beyond the English-speaking world. UNESCO's post-war library development programs brought DDC to developing nations as part of broader infrastructure aid packages. The International Federation of Library Associations promoted standardization across national library systems. By the 1970s, the DDC was in use in libraries across more than 135 countries. The total number of adopting institutions exceeded 200,000. In some countries, DDC was not the dominant system. The Library of Congress classification competed for institutional libraries, but in public libraries, in school libraries, in the community institutions where ordinary citizens encountered organized knowledge for the first time, DDC was effectively universal. This was the system's greatest achievement. And this is twist 2. And it is the one that historians of information science have not adequately explained. It was also the mechanism of its greatest destruction. A flaw in a single library's cataloging system is a local problem, correctable by a single institution. A flaw encoded into the load-bearing infrastructure of 200,000 libraries across 135 countries is not a problem. It is a permanent condition. Every structural bias in the DDC's Class 200, its treatment of world religions as a hierarchy with Christianity at the center, was now not one library's problem. It was the world's problem. Simultaneously, with no off switch, no coordinated mechanism for correction, no authority capable of requiring 200,000 institutions to simultaneously recatalog their collections. The system stored institutional energy, 200,000 installations, billions of catalog cards, generations of trained librarians. Entire professional curricula built on its notation had become the exact mechanism preventing any meaningful redesign. It had worked so long, in so many places, that it had become impossible to stop. In 1966, Henriette Avram, a systems analyst working for the Library of Congress, began designing the MARC format. Machine-readable cataloging was the first systematic attempt to convert library catalog data into a form that computers could process. The goal was efficiency. Instead of every library creating its own catalog cards by hand, a centralized authority could create a catalog record once in a standardized format and distribute it to every library that needed it. It was, in conception, the fulfillment of Charles Coffin Jewett's failed 1,850 dream. It worked. By the late 1960s, OCLC, the Online Computer Library Center, was building what would become WorldCat, the world's largest bibliographic database. By the 1980s, the card catalog was dying. Electronic catalogs were replacing it in institution after institution. And encoded into every MARC record, in every electronic catalog, in every bibliographic database, was the Dewey Decimal Classification number. the digital revolution had not freed library science from the DDC. It had frozen the DDC in code. The flaws that a human cataloger might have navigated through professional judgment, assigning a book about African American intellectual history to a classification that actually made sense, rather than the one the notation formally required, were now being processed by machines that did not navigate. They assigned, automatically, at scale. At the speed of a computer network, rather than the speed of a human hand. They had built the machine in paper and timber. Now, they rebuilt it in silicon, and the cracks came with it. In 1971, a cataloger named Sanford Berman, working at the Hennepin County Library in Minnesota, published a book called Prejudices and Antipathies. It was a systematic, meticulous, catalog entry by catalog entry analysis of the bias encoded into the DDC and its companion system, the Library of Congress subject headings. Berman documented subject headings that classified homosexuality under sexual deviations. He documented the marginalization of African American and indigenous subject matter. He documented the ways that non-Western philosophy, non-Christian religion, and non-English literature were organized as periphery, as exception, as footnote to a presumed Euro-American center. His book did not destroy the DDC. It did something more frustrating. It forced the DDC's editorial machinery to acknowledge the problem and respond to it incrementally, one revision at a time. In successive editions that patched specific egregious headings without restructuring the underlying hierarchy. The subject heading for homosexuality was eventually moved out of sexual deviations sometime in the editions of the late 1980s and 1990s as social and medical consensus shifted. Indigenous knowledge systems remained effectively uncategorized. The Class 200 seconds remained structured around Christian precedents, cultures whose entire intellectual tradition was organized on relational, non-hierarchical, non-Western principles continued to find themselves cataloged in the margins of a system that could not conceptually accommodate them without ceasing to be the system it was. Meanwhile, in Canada, Indigenous library scholars were raising identical concerns. First Nations knowledge, oral traditions, ecological relationships, governance systems, cosmologies that organized the world in ways that had no decimal equivalent, was either absent from DDC catalogs or assigned to classifications that actively distorted its meaning. They measured the damage. They did not rebuild the machine. In 2002, Hope Olson, a library scientist at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, published The Power to Name, the most thorough academic analysis of DDC's structural exclusions produced to that point. A book-length argument that the DDC's logic of specific difference fundamentally marginalized anything that did not fit neatly into its pre-existing hierarchy. By the time Olson's book appeared, the academic literature on DDC bias numbered hundreds of peer-reviewed articles. The American Library Association had issued diversity statements. Task forces had been formed, recommendations had been made and, in some cases, partially implemented. OCLC, which had acquired Forest Press in 1988 and now controlled the DDC entirely, continued to publish revised editions, DDC 22 inches 2003, DDC 23 inches 2011. Each new edition addressed specific egregious cases. None restructured the hierarchy. The estimated cost of globally recataloging the world's DDC collections, reassigning class numbers, relabeling physical volumes, updating digital records across 200,000 institutions in 135 countries has never been formally calculated. No institution, no consortium, no national government has proposed undertaking it. That question was never answered. This is Twist 3, and it is the one that the official record cannot explain away. The critical cataloging movement produced the most thorough documentation of the machine's failure in history. And that documentation became the most complete proof that the machine could not be stopped. Every anomaly was named. Every flaw was entered into the academic record. Every bias was mapped, traced, and attributed. They named every flaw. The machine kept running. There were better machines. In 1933, an Indian mathematician and librarian named S.R. Ranganathan published the colon classification, a faceted system that organized knowledge not by pre-assigned hierarchies, but by combinations of fundamental categories. A book could belong to multiple facets simultaneously. Non-Western knowledge systems could be accommodated without being forced into a pre-existing grid. The classification was, in the opinion of many library theorists who have studied both systems, structurally superior to Dewey's. It was adopted by a handful of Indian libraries. It never scaled. Henry Evelyn Bliss spent the better part of 3 decades from 1910 to 1953 developing the Bliss bibliographic classification, a system designed around the principle that classification should reflect scientific consensus about the relationships between knowledge domains. It was intellectually rigorous, regularly updated, and widely praised in library science literature. Approximately 70 libraries worldwide adopted it. The DDC, in the same period, expanded to 200,000 institutions. This was not a competition decided on merit. It was a competition decided by installed base. Ranganathan and Bliss built better machines and lost because the DDC had arrived first, had been adopted at scale first, had been embedded in professional training first, and had been encoded into Carnegie buildings first. The economics of switching the cost of retraining staff, recataloging collections, disconnecting from shared catalog records made any alternative functionally impossible for any institution already inside the DDC network. The better machine was built. No one could afford to install it. In 1998, a year before the 23rd edition of the Dewey Decimal Classification entered its editorial pipeline, a doctoral student at Stanford named Larry Page began testing a search algorithm he called PageRank. PageRank did not organize knowledge by hierarchical classification. It organized knowledge by the weight of relationships between documents, a relational, non-hierarchical, constantly self-updating system that bore no resemblance to anything Melville Dewey had imagined in Amherst in 1873. It did not assign fixed positions to knowledge. It calculated relevance dynamically, at the moment of the query, from the structure of the network itself. In 2001, Jimmy Wales launched Wikipedia. In 2012, Wikidata began building a linked open data infrastructure for structured knowledge, a system in which every entity, every concept, every relationship between concepts could be navigated without a fixed classification hierarchy, without decimal notation, without a class number assigned by a cataloger who had to fit the book's subject into a grid designed before the book's field of study existed. Within a generation, the majority of human information-seeking behavior had moved away from the classified library catalog entirely. Google processed more queries in a single hour than the entire American library system received in a year. And yet, as of DDC 23 inches 2011, the most recent full-print edition, the system remained operational in the majority of the world's public libraries. OCLC continued to issue digital updates. The decimal numbers continued to be assigned. The catalog records continued to be created, shared, and stored, not because the DDC was the best system, not because it had solved the problems Berman and Olson had named, not because it had accommodated the knowledge systems it had spent a century excluding, because it had an installed base that no alternative could displace, because 200,000 libraries had built their physical infrastructure around it, because generations of librarians had been trained in it, because the catalog records for hundreds of millions of volumes had been encoded in it, and re-encoding them would cost more than any institution could justify. The Dewey machine does not end with a rupture. There is no catastrophic event, no single moment of institutional failure, no explosion visible from a distance. It ends with attrition quiet, unannounced, invisible. One library at a time, one search engine query replacing one card drawer, one digital catalog migration quietly backgrounding the decimal number that used to be the only way to find the thing. The low hum of the system that organized the world's knowledge into 10 decimal compartments does not go silent. It fades, gradually, into the background noise of an infrastructure that has already moved on, carrying its flaws with it into new systems, new formats, new architectures that inherit its decisions without inheriting its label. The system that was built to replace human memory outlasted every challenge, survived every critique, resisted every reform, and absorbed every technological revolution. Not because it worked, Because it was already there. And somewhere, in a room with timber floors and oil lamplight, the smell of sizing on cloth binding still hangs in the air, and the question of whose knowledge the room was built to hold has never quite been answered.